The Texas Panhandle had a grit to it. You could taste it in the dust that coated your tongue. You could see it in the souls of the men who hunted there. And on this day, they weren't hunting buffalo or coyote. They were hunting a woman. From the back of a painted war pony, she watched them come. A dark tide of vengeance. A posse led by the very man who had shattered her body just the day before. But the arms holding her tight didn't belong to her husband. They belonged to a Comanche warrior, his face a mask of stone. The shouts of the posse grew louder on the wind, and a cold tremor of fear ran through her. But it wasn't a fear of the warrior. It was a fear that he might let her go. The world was a blur of ochre dust and screaming pain. Josephine Finch clung to the pony's bare back, every jarring stride sending a fresh wave of agony through her torso. The warrior's arm was like sun-baked timber, a vice locked around her waist. It was this pressure, this unyielding grip, that forced the whisper from her raw throat. "My ribs, they're already broken." The wind stole the words. She didn't know if he heard. She didn't know if he understood. His focus was a laser burning a hole in the horizon behind them. He was watching the churning cloud of dust that grew larger with every passing second. That cloud was Silas, her husband, and behind him rode the men of Redemption Gulch, their loyalty bought and paid for with Silas Kane's whiskey and silver. They thought they were on a rescue mission. They thought they were chasing a savage who had stolen the wife of the town's most prominent rancher. Josephine knew better. This wasn't a rescue. This was a hunt. And she was the fox. The warrior whose name she didn't even know shifted his weight. He urged the pony down into a shallow arroyo, the sudden dip stealing her breath. His body shielded hers from the open plain. His heat was a strange, unwelcome comfort. He was all sinew and leather, smelling of sage and horse and something else. Something wild and clean that the men pursuing them had long since sweated out. His grip tightened, not with cruelty, but with a grim purpose. He was holding her together, literally. The tight wrap of his arm was the only thing keeping the shattered pieces of her ribs from grinding against each other. It was an intimacy more profound and more terrifying than any she had ever known. They had been riding for hours ever since the hazy light of dawn. He'd appeared from the shimmering heat like a ghost. She had been at the well, the morning air cool on the bruises that painted her face and arms, when his shadow fell over her. There was no war cry, no brutal charge. He had simply dismounted, his movements economical and silent. He'd looked at the marks on her skin, then at the sprawling Kane ranch house behind her. And a flicker of something, recognition, perhaps pity, had crossed his stern features. Before she could scream, not out of fear of him, but out of the certainty of Silas's wrath, he had lifted her. She was shockingly light. He'd set her on his pony, mounted behind her, and spurred the animal into a gallop. He'd ridden them straight for the unforgiving expanse of the Llano Estacado. Now that expanse was their only hope. The posse was gaining. She could hear the baying of Bart Griggs's hounds, a sound she always associated with cornered animals. Silas would be at the forefront, his face a mask of righteous fury for the public, but his eyes would be burning with the private rage of a man whose property had been stolen. He wouldn't stop. He couldn't afford to let her live to tell her tales. The Comanche warrior guided the horse with just his knees, his hands steady. He was a master of this land, weaving through mesquite and rock formations that would have snapped the leg of a less certain animal. He glanced down at her, his dark eyes unreadable. She flinched. It was a reflex, honed by 2 years of marriage to Silas Kane. She expected a blow, a curse. Instead, he subtly adjusted his arm. His fingers found the space just below the worst of the break, lessening the direct pressure. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture. But to Josephine, it was a revelation. It was an act of consideration, of care. The posse's shouts were clearer now, carried on the wind. "He's in the wash!" That was Bart Griggs's voice, a gravelly roar. The warrior urged the horse faster, the animal's lungs working like bellows. He leaned forward, his long black hair whipping against Josephine's cheek. He whispered something, not to her, but to the horse, a stream of low, guttural sounds that were both a prayer and a command. And in that moment, she began to understand with a terrifying clarity. He was not her captor. The man behind her, the silent Comanche who held her broken body together, was shielding her. The cruelty she was fleeing wasn't in the wildness of the plains ahead. It was in the civilized savagery of the men hunting them down. He was her only shield, and he was riding them straight into the heart of a territory from which no white woman was ever said to return. 2 years earlier, Josephine Finch had arrived in Redemption Gulch as a bride from St. Louis. Her head was filled with romantic notions of the West. Silas Kane had courted her by letter, his prose as polished as the silver buttons on his waistcoat. He wrote of building an empire, of taming the land, of needing a queen to share his throne. Her father, a merchant whose fortunes were failing, saw the match as a godsend. And Silas in person was even more impressive. He was handsome, with a powerful build and a voice that could charm a rattlesnake. The town of Redemption Gulch revolved around him. His ranch, the Kane Dominion, was the largest in the territory. His cattle herds were legendary. When he rode down the town's single dusty street, men removed their hats. When he smiled at Josephine, her heart fluttered. The illusion shattered on their wedding night. The charm was a veneer, a mask for a possessiveness so absolute it suffocated her. His love was not a warmth, but a fire that sought to consume. He saw her not as a partner, but as his most prized possession, more valuable than his finest bull or his fastest horse, and to be treated with the same sense of absolute ownership. Any perceived slight, a conversation with the blacksmith that went on too long, a smile at the stable hand, a dress he deemed too colorful, was met with a cold, terrifying silence that would inevitably break into a storm of abuse. The broken ribs were the culmination of his latest rage. He had discovered she had been teaching one of the ranch hand's young sons, a boy named Finn, how to read. "You will not fill the heads of my help with ideas above their station," Silas had hissed, his voice low and menacing, dragging her from the small schoolhouse she'd set up in a disused shed. In the privacy of their opulent bedroom, a room filled with fine furniture shipped all the way from New Orleans, he had shown her the price of her defiance. The first blow had knocked the wind from her. The second had sent her crashing into the heavy oak bedpost. She'd felt the sharp, sickening crack in her side. He had stood over her, his chest heaving, his face contorted not with anger, but with a kind of righteous satisfaction. "Let this be a lesson, Josephine," he had said, straightening his tie. "You are Mrs. Silas Kane. Your world is this house. Your duty is to me. Do not forget it again." He left her on the floor, gasping for breath, the pain a white-hot fire in her chest. The next morning he had acted as if nothing had happened. He ordered the cook to bring her a special breakfast in bed and instructed the doctor, a man deep in Silas's pocket, to diagnose her with a bad fall. That was Silas's particular brand of cruelty. It was always private, always deniable. To the world, he was the doting husband, concerned for his delicate wife. To Josephine, he was the architect of a gilded cage, and its bars were her own bruised flesh. She knew that any attempt to flee, any cry for help, would be dismissed as the hysterics of a fragile woman. Silas had made sure of that. He had insulated himself with a wall of influence and money. Who would believe her over the great Silas Kane? Miles away and years before, the warrior who called himself Noon had known a different kind of pain. His name meant wanderer in the tongue of the Numunu, the people. He had not always been a wanderer. He had once had a place, a family. His band, a small group of Quahati Comanche, had tried to live peacefully on the edge of the white man's world. They traded hides for flour and coffee, holding to the old ways as the tide of settlers rose around them. Noon had a wife, a quiet woman named Meadowlark, and a young son, Little Hawk, whose laughter was the brightest thing in his life. Then the surveyors had come. They were led by a hard-faced man with cold eyes, a man who spoke of lines on a map that superseded the claims of sky and earth. They said the land had been sold to a cattle baron. They offered a pittance for the band to move on. When Noon's uncle, the chief, refused, the surveyors left, promising to return. They returned not with papers, but with rifles. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. They came at dawn, the same time of day Josephine was taken, and set fire to the lodges. Noon had fought with the fury of a cornered wolf, but they were too many. He saw a meadowlark cut down as she ran with their son. He saw a little hawk fall. A bullet tore through his shoulder, and another grazed his temple, sending him into darkness. He awoke to silence and smoke. Everyone was gone. The surveyors had been thorough. He buried his family with his bare hands, the grief a stone in his chest that would never dissolve. He learned later from a sympathetic Mexican trader the name of the man who had bought the land, the man who had paid the surveyors for their bloody work, Silas Kane. Noon became a ghost, a wanderer on the plains that had once been his home. He watched the white man's world with cold, patient hatred. He watched the grand ranch house being built on the ashes of his village. And he watched the beautiful, sad woman who lived there. He saw her from a distance, her shoulders slumped, her eyes holding a familiar shadow of pain. He saw Silas Kane's public displays of affection and the way she flinched from his touch. One evening, crouched in the scrub overlooking the ranch, he saw through a telescope stolen from a cavalry patrol the scene by the schoolhouse. He saw Silas drag her away. He knew with an instinct honed by a lifetime of reading the signs of predators what would happen next. He was not driven by a desire to save her, not in the way the white men would understand it. He was driven by a need to defy Silas Kane, to take something from the man who had taken everything from him. And in the woman's haunted eyes, he saw the ghost of his own people, trapped and brutalized by a man who believed the world was his to own. Taking her was an act of war. It was an act of justice. It was the only act he had left. The Llano Estacado, the staked plains, was a sea of grass that stretched to an endless horizon. It was a place that broke men and swallowed armies. To Josephine, it was a terrifying void. To Nune, it was a sanctuary. He knew its secrets, the hidden seeps where water bubbled from the earth, the buffalo wallows that held rainwater, the draws and canyons that offered shelter from the punishing sun and sweeping winds. He moved across this landscape not as a trespasser, but as a part of it, his senses alive to every shift in the wind, every track in the dust. For 2 days they traveled, the posse falling behind, their clumsy, water-dependent pursuit no match for Noon's intimate knowledge of the land. But they did not give up. At night, Josephine could sometimes see the faint orange glimmer of their campfire, a distant and menacing star on the black horizon. Her pain gradually subsided from a roaring fire to a dull, persistent ache. Noon was a surprisingly gentle nurse. He had a pouch of dried leaves, yarrow, she thought, which he crushed and mixed with water to make a poultice for her bruises. He tore strips from his own spare tunic to bind her ribs, his touch firm and impersonal, yet careful. He shared his meager rations of jerky and dried berries without a word, always ensuring she ate first. Communication was a silent language of gestures, a nod toward a water source, a hand held up to signal a halt, a pointed finger at a circling hawk, a silent warning. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture, the tension in his shoulders that meant he sensed danger, the slight relaxation that meant they were safe for the moment. She found herself watching him, this silent, grim man. He was not the grunting savage of the Penny Dreadfuls. There was a profound and sorrowful intelligence in his eyes. When he looked at the land, it was with a look of reverence, of belonging. When he looked at her, it was with an unnerving perception, as if he could see the bars of the cage she had just escaped. One afternoon, as they rested in the shade of a rock overhang, she found her voice. "Why?" The word was a croak. Noon was sharpening the head of a spear with a piece of flint. He didn't look up, but he paused his work. "Why did you take me?" she clarified, her voice stronger. He set down the spearhead and finally met her gaze. He held up his hand and touched the fading yellow and purple bruise on his own cheekbone, a mirror to the one on hers. Then he pointed back in the direction from which they had come, toward the Kane Dominion, toward Silas. The gesture was simple, but its meaning was vast and unequivocal. I saw, I know. A wave of emotion so powerful it buckled her knees washed over Josephine. For 2 years her suffering had been invisible, her reality denied by everyone around her. This man, this stranger, this supposed enemy had seen the truth from a distance. In that moment, he felt less like a captor and more like the only witness she had ever had. Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back streamed down her face. She didn't bother to wipe them away. Back in Redemption Gulch, Silas Kane was orchestrating a masterpiece of public theater. He had ridden back into town, his face a perfect mask of grief and fury. "He took her!" He'd bellowed from the steps of the saloon, his voice breaking with practiced despair. "A Comanche brute snatched her right from the well. We have to get her back." He offered a reward of $500, a fortune, for her safe return, and $100 for the warrior's scalp. Men who had never ventured farther than the county line suddenly became seasoned trackers. Bart Griggs, Silas's brutish ranch foreman, organized the posse, his loyalty absolute. Only one man in town was immune to the hysteria: Marshal Jedediah Stone. Stone was an older man, his face a roadmap of hard-won experience. He had served as a Texas Ranger before settling into the quieter, but no less complicated job of keeping the peace in Redemption Gulch. He was methodical, observant, and deeply skeptical of easy answers. He had ridden out to the Kane Dominion to investigate the scene of the abduction. Something felt wrong. There was no sign of a struggle. Not a single overturned bucket, not a scuff mark in the dirt to suggest a woman had been dragged away, fighting for her life. Furthermore, when he discreetly questioned Maria, the Kane's Mexican cook, her eyes had been filled with a fear that seemed directed more at her employer than any Comanche. "Mrs. Kane," Maria had whispered, twisting her apron, "she had a bad fall yesterday." A bad fall. Jedediah Stone had seen the results of bad falls on ranchers' wives before. They rarely involved a single Comanche appearing out of nowhere the next morning. Now, as he rode with the posse, he watched Silas. The man was playing his part beautifully, shouting encouragement, pointing out imagined tracks, whipping his men into a frenzy. But his eyes, Jedediah noticed, were cold and calculating. There was no desperate fear for a beloved wife in those eyes. There was only the grim determination of a hunter closing in on his quarry. Silas wasn't trying to rescue Josephine. He was making sure she was silenced for good, and he was using an entire town to help him do it. Jedediah slowed his horse, letting the main body of the posse ride ahead. He dismounted and examined the ground. The tracks of the Comanche pony were clear, but alongside them he saw something else: the faint, almost erased tracks of a second horse that had been tethered in the scrub nearby for a long time. This wasn't a snatch and grab. The warrior had been watching the Kane ranch, waiting. The question wasn't just why the Comanche had taken her. The question was why he had chosen that specific morning to do it. The morning after her bad fall, Jedediah Stone mounted his horse, a cold knot of certainty tightening in his gut. The story Silas Kane was selling, the story the whole town had bought, was a lie. And the truth was somewhere out on the Llano Estacado, riding with a broken woman and a lone Comanche warrior. Noon led them to a place that did not seem possible in the flat emptiness of the plains. A deep, narrow fissure sliced through the caprock, hidden until you were nearly upon it. They descended a winding, rocky path into a canyon oasis. A small stream fed by an underground spring trickled through a grove of cottonwood trees. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and wild plums. It felt like a secret world. Here, for the first time since the chase began, they were truly safe. The canyon was easily defensible and nearly impossible to find by chance. For a week they remained. The rhythm of their days was simple. Noon would hunt a rabbit, a brace of quail, with a quiet efficiency that amazed Josephine. He moved through the canyon like a spirit, never wasting a motion. He showed her which plants were edible, which roots held water, how to weave cordage from yucca fibers. He was not teaching her as a master teaches a student, but as one survivor sharing knowledge with another. The silence between them began to fill with words. His English was broken, learned from traders and soldiers, but his meaning was often clearer than the flowery, deceitful speeches she was used to. "This land," he said one evening, gesturing to the canyon walls painted gold by the setting sun, "was home for my people." He told her his story in fragments, the narrative pieced together over several nights by the light of a small, smokeless fire. He spoke of the village that had stood where the Kane Dominion now sprawled. He spoke of the surveyors. He spoke of his wife, Meadow Lark, and his son, Little Hawk. He did not cry, but a desolate emptiness entered his eyes that was more profound than tears. And then he spoke the name. Silas Kane. He said the words as if they were poison on his tongue. He paid for the guns, for the fire, for my family. Josephine stared at him, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Her husband's empire was built on a foundation of blood and ash. The cruelty she had endured was just a small, private echo of a much larger, more monstrous violence. I didn't know, she whispered, the words feeling pitifully inadequate. Noon looked at her, his gaze intense. You know now. It was a statement, not an accusation. He was right. She did know, and that knowledge was a burden and a weapon. He keeps a book, she said, her voice barely audible. A ledger. In his study, behind a false panel in the wall. Noon's eyes narrowed. I saw it once. He thought I was asleep. It's not just land deeds. It's payments, names, dates, surveying fees to a man named Griggs, payments for clearing the land. She finally understood what that euphemism meant. It meant clearing the people. Her husband wasn't just a brute. He was a murderer on a grand scale. That book, she continued, a spark of defiance igniting within her. It proves everything. It proves what he did to your people and to others. He's cheated and killed his way across this whole territory. A new understanding passed between them. This was no longer just about her escape or his revenge. This was about justice, the kind of justice that couldn't be found in the corrupt courthouse in Redemption Gulch. This book, Noon said, his voice low. Where is it? Josephine looked down at her simple, dirt-stained dress. Before she had gone to the well that fateful morning, after Silas had left her broken on the floor, she had done something born of pure, desperate instinct. She had retrieved the ledger. It was a slim volume, and she had torn out the most incriminating pages. Then, with a needle and thread, she had painstakingly stitched them into the lining of her petticoat. She had been planning something, an escape perhaps, a desperate plea to the law, but she hadn't known how. She met his eyes. I have it, she said. I have the proof. Noon stared at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than grief or grim determination in his face. It was a sliver of hope, sharp and dangerous and bright. Her personal hell had just collided with his, and in the wreckage they had found a common cause. She was no longer just a victim he was shielding. She was a witness, and she carried the weapon that could finally bring down the man who had destroyed both their worlds. Marshal Jedediah Stone was a patient man. While the rest of the posse charged ahead, fueled by Silas Kane's whiskey and promises of reward money, Jedediah lingered. He was not tracking a Comanche. He was unraveling a crime. And the more he circled the edges of the official story, the more it frayed. He found their first camp. It was neat, the fire pit small and expertly concealed. He found the remnants of a poultice. Picking it up, he recognized the distinct smell of yarrow. It was used for treating wounds and swelling. It confirmed his suspicion that Josephine was injured before her supposed abduction. His investigation took him on a wide loop back toward Redemption Gulch. Following a hunch, he visited the small homestead of the Miller family, whose land bordered the vast Kane Dominion to the east. Old Man Miller was a cantankerous but honest man who had no love for his powerful neighbor. Kane's been trying to buy me out for years, Miller grumbled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Jedediah's boot. Wants my stream. I keep saying no. Funny thing, though, my fences keep getting cut. Couple of my cows get sick. My boy Finn, he used to do chores for Kane, but he got sent packing last week. Why was that? Jedediah asked, keeping his tone casual. Kane's missus was learning him his letters. Miller's wife, Martha, chimed in from the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. A sweeter woman you'll never meet, always had a kind word, but frail and sad, like a bird in a cage. Silas Kane caught her with Finn, and he had a look on his face, Marshal, a look I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. Sent the boy home right quick. Mrs. Kane, we ain't seen her outside since. That was the day before she was taken. The pieces were falling into place. A kind woman defies her powerful husband. The husband explodes in a rage. The woman sustains an injury she has to call a bad fall. The next morning she disappears. Jedediah thanked the Millers and rode on, his jaw tight. He was no longer just a peace officer. He was the only man standing between Josephine Kane and her husband. He was sure now that Silas's posse wasn't a rescue party. It was a death squad. Silas needed to ensure his wife never spoke to anyone in authority. He was using the hunt for the Comanche as a cover to murder his own wife and pin the blame on a savage. The marshal's conscience, a thing he had thought hardened by years of frontier justice, was a lead weight in his stomach. He had upheld the law his whole life. But what did the law mean when it was being wielded as a weapon by the rich and powerful? What was his duty? To rescue a woman and hand her back to her tormentor, a man who would surely kill her? Or to find her first and listen to her side of the story? He looked out across the Llano Estacado. It was a vast, intimidating place. The Comanche and Josephine could be anywhere. But Jedediah knew the land too. He knew the likely places for water, for shelter. He knew about a place the old-timers called the Canyon of Whispers, a hidden fissure in the rock that was a traditional refuge for those fleeing the law or injustice. He turned his horse, leaving the posse's trail behind. He would not be a pawn in Silas Kane's game. He would be a marshal of the law, and the law demanded the truth. He rode alone, guided by a compass of conviction. His hunt no longer for a fugitive, but for a witness. He prayed he would find her before Silas did. The peace of the canyon was shattered by the distant sharp crack of a rifle shot echoing off the rock walls. Noon, who had been teaching Josephine how to set a snare, froze. His head snapped up, his body instantly alert. He grabbed his bow and a handful of arrows, his movements fluid and silent. "They found us," Josephine whispered, her blood turning to ice. "Not found," Noon corrected her, his eyes scanning the rim of the canyon high above. "Found the canyon, not us. Stay here. Do not make a sound." He melted into the trees and rocks, disappearing as if the earth had swallowed him. Josephine's heart hammered against her healing ribs. She scrambled behind a thicket of wild plums, her hands trembling. She could hear them now, the jingle of harnesses, the dislodged clatter of rocks, and the gruff voices of men. "Spread out!" It was Bart Grigg's voice, raw and impatient. "He's in here somewhere. Kane wants the woman alive if possible. The buck he just wants dead." Josephine pressed herself flatter against the ground. Alive if possible. The words sent a fresh wave of terror through her. Silas wanted her back. He wanted the satisfaction of finishing what he'd started, of breaking her completely before discarding her. She heard the telltale hiss of an arrow, followed by a choked cry and the heavy thud of a body falling. A volley of rifle fire erupted in response, bullets thudding into the trees around her, splintering bark and shredding leaves. Noon was a ghost among them, striking and vanishing, using his knowledge of the terrain to sow chaos. But he was one man against a dozen. The gunshots grew closer. She could hear the men crashing through the undergrowth, cursing and shouting. Suddenly, a new voice cut through the din, sharp and authoritative. "Hold your fire! Hold your fire, damn you!" Peeking through the leaves, Josephine saw Marshal Jedediah Stone, his horse picking its way down the treacherous path. He had his pistol drawn, but it was pointed at the sky. "Griggs, what in God's name do you think you're doing? You're firing blind. You'll hit the woman!" the marshal yelled. Bart Griggs, a bear of a man with a stained beard, lowered his rifle, a sneer on his face. "Just following orders, Marshal. Mr. Kane wants his wife back." "This isn't a rescue, it's a massacre," Stone retorted, his eyes sweeping the canyon. "Where is Kane?" "He's waiting up top," Griggs grunted. "Didn't want to risk the path. Said we were to bring her to him." Just then, a twig snapped behind Josephine. She spun around to see two of Griggs's men grinning at her, their rifles leveled. "Well, look what we have here," one of them said, his eyes lingering on her torn dress. "The little lost bird." Before they could grab her, an arrow sprouted from the man's chest. He stared down at it in stunned disbelief before crumpling to the ground. The second man swung his rifle around, but Noon was already there, dropping from a low-hanging branch like a panther. He drove his knife into the man's side, a swift, brutal, and silent motion. Noon grabbed Josephine's arm, pulling her to her feet. We go. Now. They were exposed. Griggs and the other men saw them and raised their rifles. There they are! But before they could fire, Marshal Stone spurred his horse directly between them and the posse. Stand down, I said. Stone roared, his pistol now aimed squarely at Griggs's chest. This is official Marshal's business now. I will have the truth of this matter. Griggs hesitated, his face a mask of confusion and rage. He was loyal to Silas Kane's money, but shooting a U.S. Marshal was a hanging offense. That moment of hesitation was all Noon needed. He pulled Josephine along, scrambling up the far side of the canyon wall, using handholds and paths that seemed invisible. Bullets whizzed past them, sparking off the rocks. They were nearing the top when a figure appeared on the rim, silhouetted against the bright sky. It was Silas. He held a rifle, and his face was a portrait of pure hatred. He wasn't looking at Noon. His eyes were fixed on Josephine. You ungrateful whore! Silas screamed, his voice echoing across the canyon. The charming facade stripped away to reveal the monster beneath. You thought you could run from me? He raised the rifle, taking careful aim. Josephine froze, paralyzed by the sight of the man who had haunted her every waking moment. This was it, the end. Noon acted without thinking. He shoved her hard, sending her tumbling behind a rocky outcrop, out of the line of fire. In the same motion, he drew his bow, nocked an arrow, and let it fly. It was a desperate, long-distance shot. Silas fired at the same instant. Josephine heard two sounds almost simultaneously, the deep boom of the rifle and the meaty thwack of the arrow finding its mark. She looked up in time to see Silas stagger back, the arrow embedded deep in his shoulder. But she also saw Noon jolt, a dark stain blossoming on his leather tunic, high on his chest. He stumbled, his bow clattering on the rocks, and fell to one knee, his face contorted in pain. Down below, the standoff was broken. Seeing Silas hit, Griggs and his men opened fire with a renewed fury. Marshal Stone, his choice now made for him, wheeled his horse around and fired back at the posse, providing cover. Go! Noon grunted at Josephine, trying to rise. Get out of here! But she didn't run. The woman who had flinched at every raised voice, who had lived in terror for 2 years, didn't run. She grabbed Noon's fallen bow and a spare arrow. She had watched him for weeks. She knew how it worked. With fumbling, desperate hands, she knocked the arrow, rose from behind the rock, and aimed. Not at Silas, but at the frayed rope holding a large, precariously balanced boulder on the canyon rim, a remnant of an old rock slide. Griggs and his men were advancing on the Marshal. Silas was trying to reload his rifle, his arm wounded. Josephine let the arrow fly. It was a clumsy, wobbling shot, but it was true enough. The arrow sliced through the rope. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then with a deep groan, the boulder shifted, tearing loose and crashing down the canyon side, bringing a torrent of rock and dirt with it. It didn't hit anyone directly, but it landed squarely in the path of the advancing posse, cutting them off from the Marshal and from the trail leading up to Josephine and Noon. The canyon filled with dust and the roar of the landslide. The battle was over. The dust settled, revealing a scene of chaos below. Griggs and his men were trapped, their path blocked by a mountain of fresh rubble. Marshal Stone sat on his horse, coughing in the dust, his pistol still smoking. On the rim above, Silas Kane clutched his wounded shoulder, his face a mask of disbelief and fury as he stared at Josephine. He had been beaten by her. Josephine rushed to Noon's side. The wound was bad. The bullet had gone clean through, but it was high in his chest, dangerously close to his lung. He was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. Marshal! Josephine screamed, her voice raw. Slowly, carefully, Stone made his way up the canyon wall. He approached them cautiously, his gun holstered, but his hand resting on the grip. His eyes took in the scene. The wounded Comanche and the woman who was clearly protecting him, not cowering from him. Ma'am, he said, his voice respectful, are you Josephine Kane? I am, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands as she tried to apply pressure to Noon's wound. And this man, he abducted you? Stone asked, his eyes searching hers for the truth. "This man," Josephine said, meeting his gaze without flinching, "saved my life. The man who was trying to kill me is my husband." From the opposite rim, Silas began to scream obscenities at them, his voice filled with impotent rage. "She's a liar, a hysterical lying witch. She's bewitched by that savage. Kill them both and I'll double the reward." But his spell was broken. The men below could see the truth now. They saw a U.S. Marshal siding against them. They saw their wealthy employer revealed as a raving madman. Their loyalty, bought with coin, evaporated in the face of a landslide and a federal officer. "It's over, Kane!" Marshal Stone shouted across the chasm. "You're under arrest for attempted murder." "You'll have to take me!" Silas shrieked, fumbling to reload his rifle with one good arm. "That can be arranged," Stone said grimly. With practiced calm, the marshal raised his own rifle, took aim, and fired. The shot was not aimed to kill. The bullet kicked up dirt right at Silas's feet. Panicked and off balance, Silas stumbled backward, his heel caught on the edge of the cliff. For a moment he teetered there, his eyes wide with shock. Then with a final desperate cry, he fell, tumbling into the canyon he had sought to turn into a tomb. A heavy silence descended, broken only by Noon's labored breathing. Josephine ripped a strip of cloth from her petticoat. As she did, the stiff, stitched-in pages of the ledger rustled. She looked at Marshal Stone. "My husband didn't just try to murder me, Marshal," she said, her voice ringing with newfound strength. "He's a thief and a mass murderer, and I have the proof." She carefully cut the stitches with Noon's knife and pulled out the folded yellowed pages. She handed them to the marshal. He unfolded them, his eyes scanning the columns of names, dates, and damning figures. He saw the payment to Griggs for clearing the land. He saw the fraudulent deeds. He saw the cold, methodical accounting of Silas Kane's bloody rise to power. He looked from the pages to the wounded Comanche warrior, and then to the determined woman tending to him. The whole sordid story of Redemption Gulch was laid bare. "I'll be damned," Jedediah Stone whispered. He tucked the pages safely into his coat. "Mrs. Kane, it appears this territory owes you both a great debt." They took Noon not to Redemption Gulch, but to the old Miller homestead. Martha Miller, a woman who knew true kindness when she saw it, tended to his wound with skill and compassion. Marshal Stone posted a deputy outside to ensure no misguided fool sought to claim the old bounty. The ledger pages caused an earthquake in the territory. With Bart Griggs and his men captured and ready to talk in exchange for leniency, the full extent of the Kane Dominion's corruption was exposed. Federal investigators arrived, and the empire built on bones began to crumble. Josephine stayed at the Miller farm until Noon was strong enough to travel. The days were quiet. They rarely spoke, but there was a deep and abiding understanding between them. They were two survivors from two different worlds, bound by a shared trauma and a shared victory. She had saved him on the canyon rim, and he had saved her from a life that was a slow death. The day he was ready to leave, he came to her as she stood watching the sunset paint the plains. He was dressed in simple buckskins provided by the marshal, his own tunic ruined. "You will be safe now," he said. It was a statement of fact. "Yes," she replied, "thanks to you. What will you do?" He looked out at the vast open land. "My path is not here. I will find what is left of my people. The Numanu are still here. We wander, but we are not gone." She wanted to ask him to stay. She wanted to tell him that she felt more at home with him in the stark wilderness than she ever had in her husband's mansion. But she knew it was impossible. Their worlds had touched, even merged for a time, but they could not remain one. "Will I see you again?" she asked, the question hanging in the cool evening air. He reached out and for the first and only time, gently touched the faded bruise on her cheek. It was a gesture of farewell, of acknowledgement, of a bond that needed no more words. "The hawk and the sparrow fly in the same sky, Josephine Finch," he said, using her full name for the first time, "but they do not share a nest." He turned and walked to the pinto pony the marshal had procured for him. With a final look at her, a look that conveyed a world of gratitude and sorrow, he mounted the horse and rode away. Not into the sunset, but north, toward the smoke-colored hills, becoming a smaller and smaller silhouette until the plains reclaimed him. Josephine Finch did not return to St. Louis. She stayed. She used her inheritance, what little was left of Silas's legitimate holdings, to buy the old schoolhouse and a small plot of land. She became a teacher, not just for children like Finn Miller, but for women. Women who were trapped, women who needed a safe harbor, women who needed to be reminded that even when their ribs were broken, their spirits didn't have to be. She never remarried. Some nights, when the wind swept down from the Llano Estacado, she would stand on her porch and look out into the great, wild darkness, and she would listen for the echo of a hawk's cry on the wind. The story of Josephine Finch and the warrior Noon is a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest cruelty wears a civilized mask, and the truest shield is found in the most unexpected hands. Their tale reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. It's a story of how two people from warring worlds found common ground in their shared pain and forged a moment of justice in a land that had little. They were two separate trails destined to cross, but never to merge, leaving an indelible mark on the history of the West and on each other. If their incredible story of survival and unlikely alliance moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share this tale with others who appreciate stories of the true untamed West. And be sure to subscribe to our channel for more historical dramas that bring the past to life. Thank you for listening.